get started. So, hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of This is Recruiting. It's going to be a little bit of a breakaway this time because I know usually we've got Rebecca, who used to be hosting these webinars, but today, unfortunately, she's unwell. She's down with COVID, wishing her a speedy recovery. So it's going to be me, Alfred, who's going to be filling in. So just by way of introductions, I head the marketing team here at HackerEarth. And today I've got with me none other than Clifton Jadoo. Clifton, why don't you perhaps go ahead and give a quick introduction to yourself?
Yeah, of course. Thanks for the quick intro. So my name is Clifton. I've been doing tech recruitment for about 10 years. Started off on the agency side, then transitioned as a second talent hire for a company called Compass. They did like tech real estate. And then I moved over to Foursquare to lead and head our engine product recruiter for about 5.5 years. And just recently, literally just last month, I joined a new company called Workflow to help out the engine recruiting efforts.
Great. Thanks for your introduction, Clifton. So today we're going to be talking about a topic that's actually very close to my heart as well, because this is something that I have been trying to address with anybody I speak with from the recruiting world for the last 7 or 8 years, or maybe even 10 years for that matter. Right? Every time I strike up a conversation with anyone in tech recruiting, this is one of the talking points that we always come up with. What are your challenges today? It could be from sourcing to screening. It could be something else altogether. But I always get a good mix of interesting answers to this question. And today, I'm here to find out what Cliff has to say about some of these really, really pressing challenges in tech hiring today, and how you can probably go ahead and avoid them. So move on. So before we jump into that, and apologies if this is a little low resolution, I'm just gonna give you a very quick plug on HackerEarth, right? Because we talk about problems in tech recruiting, we talk about all the challenges they face. We're here to solve all of those challenges, and we've been doing that since 2012. Right? And we've been one of the first companies in the entire tech recruiting space, in the tech assessment space rather. And this is something that we've been doing in and out, and we've been able to get a lot of success to all the clients who signed up with us. So in a nutshell, what we do is we help you with two things. One, we help you conduct hackathons to ensure that your employer branding is definitely up there, and then you can attract the best talent possible. And that's our pre-hire solution, which is basically to attract and source great developer talent through hackathons and even hiring hackathons for that matter. Then the core of our platform hinges on screening and interviewing. And we have a technical assessment solution which will help you evaluate candidates like never before. Right? You just need to kind of spend 5 minutes in creating a test based on your JD or skill or the role that you have in mind. Send that test out to all those candidates who've applied for the position in your company, and just like magic, they can assess themselves. And once everyone's done, you get a leaderboard telling you exactly who's the best, who you should go forward with and who you shouldn't, putting them right to an interview, which is something we do with a tool we've got called Face Code, which is basically the best way to do technical interviews. It's got like a real-time pair programming tool where you can code, the candidate can code as well. You can put in a lot of snippets and challenges in between. And the best part, you don't even have to wait for your engineering manager or your hiring manager to give you a report on whether a candidate was good or not. Everything happens automatically. After an interview is done, there are scoring parameters, and then once you're done with that scoring parameters, a feedback report is generated almost instantly, and then you can use that to kind of make an informed decision whether to go ahead with the candidate. We also use assessments for continuously assessing candidates, which will be plugged into your LMS. And then finally, you can also engage your internal talent through hackathons. It's not just to crowdsource ideas from the outside world or to engage with developers outside of your organization. You can also engage the internal talent and keep them on their toes and get the best out of them and get ideas flowing from your internal workforce through internal hackathons. So that's what HackerEarth does in a nutshell. If you're interested in finding out more about how we can help, please do drop us a note, and then we'll definitely be able to help you get started. All right, so without further ado, let's jump right into the questions. First one, and this is just a little bit of a context for the same software developer role, right, across maybe 5 or 10 different companies. I've seen 10 different JDs, right? And that's happened. And folks who I know from the community have always been coming back to me saying that, hey, look, I saw this JD out there, it looked completely different. I don't even know if it's accurate, if it's apt for me to go out there and apply for this. And then I see a similar role with a different JD that looks a lot more enticing. So let's try and break that down. Let's try and establish what's the best way to develop a perfect, or how do you develop the perfect developer JD?
Yeah, no, of course. And the way I see it is what works for the perfect developer JD also works for the perfect non-developer JD. Because I feel like to create the perfect job description, it's, in my opinion, a list of like specific steps. One, you want to fully understand the role itself and be as specific as possible. Because I feel like a lot of times, just like you mentioned, you can see 10 different job descriptions for like, they look like 10 different roles when in fact they're the same role, there's 10 different companies. So the way I like to kind of like process and construct my job descriptions is one, fully understand the teams and the projects themselves, because that's step one, is understanding what the role does. Number two is I like to really separate the nice to haves and the must haves, because too many times I'm sure we've all seen a job description where it's like 25 bullet points. And that's just like a laundry list or like a shopping list. So with me, I like to kind of reduce the bullet points to probably like 4 or 5 related to the role itself. Because when you think about it, 4 to 5 is easier to read and digest. So it's not just like a giant block of text. And that's also another thing is really nice and easy formatting. Because if you see like a giant block of text, you would automatically be dismissive. So it's always good to just kind of break it out and really format it correctly. And one other thing I've been a really huge proponent on at multiple companies is really using inclusive and neutral language. So no like JavaScript rock stars or JavaScript ninjas or any of those types of words. There are various products out there that kind of like look at how inclusive your job descriptions are. But I've always been a huge proponent of trying to make it as neutral and as inclusive as possible. Another thing I've been a really big proponent of is put in the company's core values or core behaviors, as well as some benefits of the role in the job description. So I've seen companies put it on a separate page, but when you think about it, if you're on one page and you have to click up to another page, there's a higher chance that you probably just like not even click on it, or you might just leave the website. So I like to make a job description very basically as expensive as possible. I want to include as much information, and I usually like to do core values, core behaviors, as well as just some of the high level benefits. So the candidate really understands like the comprehensive package potentially. And I also like to use words and common job titles. So I've seen also companies do like very like numbered levels or very niche like titles. So like strategic engineer level 4. If you're not in the organization, that doesn't really tell me anything compared to senior software engineer. Senior software engineer, I could identify and understand better than like this strategic engineer level 4, level 5. Another thing I like to do as well is highlight that a candidate doesn't have to meet every single one of these roles requirements in order to apply. Because research has shown, some groups and some populations feel like they have to hit 100% of the requirements to apply. Whereas when I've seen individuals, I myself, when I look back in my career, I've applied to jobs where I only probably hit 30% or 50%, and I ended up getting the offer right there. So I think it's always important to highlight in the job description that like, hey, even if you don't meet these requirements, 100% still apply. But those are like some of the high level bullet points that I always try to include in the process to craft a perfect job description. And just to recap, really be informed, really laid out, very easy to follow in a format in order to really craft the perfect job description overall.
Got it. Thanks for that. That's interesting. I do have a couple of things that I want to note as well. So everyone talks about making your JD very inclusive, right? They talk about maybe having gender neutral terms, right? They talk about making it inclusive to maybe different sections of the community. So is there anything that you need to keep in mind, perhaps, to kind of make your JD really very inclusive, and that's something that people from all walks of life can be happy to apply to?
Yeah, I think there's certain like products out there, and like some of these products are free. It's like, so for example, I use like Textio, which is one of these programs where you just like copy and paste your job description, and it would basically highlight which words are like gendered, which words are not, and then kind of make recommendations. And I think that's, that's step one to attract talent, is you want to be as inclusive as possible, and you don't want to use like these very like gendered terms. So I feel like that's always like a very essential part that's often unfortunately overlooked at a lot of companies, is when you make the perfect job description, that's step one. That's what the candidate sees first. So I think it's very important to make sure you have that really neutral and inclusive job description so the candidate can see themselves working at your company.
Got it. And just a quick follow-up on the last point that you raised up as well. Like, you did mention that it's not really necessary for someone to be a 100% fit in terms of everything that's mentioned on the JD. Do you call that out? I mean, I've seen a lot of people hesitate on applying for a job because they're like, oh, wait a minute, I've just got like 3 out of 5 or 3 out of 6, perhaps, like, requirements from the JD, and I don't think I fit into the other 3. And it obviously would deter someone from, applying for that job. So do you tend to call it out, saying that, hey, these are good to haves, must haves, or do you just leave it at that?
Oh, no. So it's actually funny. We actually, at Webflow, we put that in our job description. We're like, hey, even if you don't meet the 100% of the qualifications, you just still seriously consider applying. And in the past, what I've done is I've usually separated it from like, the must-haves and the nice-to-haves. And with the must-haves, I try to really reduce it just to really make sure they're all must-haves. Because sometimes people fit a lot of nice-to-haves under must-haves. So that's, once again, it's really important for the recruiter and the hiring manager to be on the same page. And the way I kind of portray it to the hiring manager is to reduce it as much as possible, because the less must-haves you have, the quicker it is to find these individuals. And that's oftentimes got the hiring manager on the same page with me from the past.
Got it. That makes sense. I mean, like, the lesser the barriers for someone to actually apply for a job, the better, because you never know. I mean, once you give them a take-home coding test or an assessment, they might sometimes end up on top and surprise you.
Yeah, and like when you think about it, you can only fit so much on a resume. So like it's hard to fit like an entire person's like professional career on a piece of paper. So they might have overlooked some stuff that they should have included. So I always like to kind of give like an individual the benefit of the doubt, because just like you say, sometimes you never really know.
Got it. Yeah. All right, great. Thanks for that. So there you have it, folks. That's how we create the perfect developer JD. Yeah, I think we can move on. So the next question that I have is, well, again, something that's been a bit of a hot debate, right? So we talk about companies that run on legacy tech stacks at times, right? And we talk about like how difficult it could be for someone to kind of like attract younger generation right now to kind of really apply for jobs in that legacy tech stack, and it could also be a skills gap. So what's your current tech stack right now, and then like how do you ensure as an organization that you really stay updated and stay ahead of the game? Because I mean, I snap my finger and a new language comes up and a new competency comes up somewhere, right? So how do you stay ahead? How long do you tend to continue on a particular tech stack, and do you tend to change it, or because requirements is also going to change, right? So how do you approach that?
Yeah, no, of course. I'll go over quickly like our current tech stack just to give it like a glimpse of what Webflow's tech stack looks like. And then I'll give some important insights on like how, a company in general can kind of stay ahead of the curve. So our current tech stack right now on the front-end architectural end, it's largely made up of React, Flux, and Cypress. And then we use the GraphQL that connects to Node. And we also use like Express, Mongo, and Apollo right now. And to answer the last part of your question, some important insights is really to have an inch culture that really keeps up with the trends and make changes when necessary. And this is the important part, that when changes are made, to really include like the tech leads, the tech architects, and any team that works very closely to the tech stack, just to really ensure that, because once again, it's a large sunk cost when you like migrate over. So you really want to be as strategic as possible. And the things that I like to think about from a recruiter perspective when changing tech stacks is two concepts. It's vertical scalability and horizontal scalability. So what I mean by vertical scalability is how easy is it to add new features using a particular tech stack. So like I like to think of it as like Lego blocks stacking one on top of another. And then the concept of horizontal scalability is basically how scalable is the tech stack and really accommodating user growth. So like if you only have like, let's say 10,000 users, you might be able to get away with like using a particular tech stack. But once you post like 1, 2, 3 million, you might have to use like a different tech stack. So really balancing between those two concepts. And from a recruiting perspective, I like to always advise the hiring teams to really take account what the current team's expertise is and really loop in the talent team to really understand this new tech stack that they're considering. How easy is it to recruit for versus the current tech stack? So this is often one thing that I think gets overlooked. But once again, a really good recruiting partnership is really involving the talent team in these discussions, because it is important to involve the engineers, the product managers, in if there's any type of changes to the tech stack. But at the same time, you also want to include the talent team because they have a certain level of like insight into how difficult is it to like recruit new individuals, while there's like junior, mid-level, senior. And it's really another consideration where I think having a recruiting partner helps a lot. It's really helping to coach the hiring teams and also like the leadership team in weighing the benefits and not having too much proprietary technology. Because while proprietary technology might be good internally, I always like to consider like, hey, what if like XYZ percentage of individuals leave? Because if something is proprietary, it's going to basically lengthen the onboarding time for new individuals. So like these are all like insights I like to really think of at a high level, is involving not only the tech stakeholders, but also the talent stakeholders, understand those two concepts between vertical and horizontal scalability, and not having too much proprietary tech, just because you want to make sure you use like the popular languages because it's easier to recruit for in general.
Got it. And how's that done today across industries, maybe across the companies that you've worked in as well? I mean, does this decision involve the recruiting team as a key stakeholder, or are decisions on stack taken solely by the tech teams right now?
So I've been in companies that has done both. The ones that I've seen that has had more success usually involves the talent team, because once again, and this is something that could be easily overlooked for, because like when you have like your roadmap for the year, you're only focusing on your roadmap for the year. When it comes to recruiting is both like proactive and reactive. So a lot of times they get overlooked. So I feel like companies who often involve the talent team really has a high chance of success for not only maintaining the same growth of the engineering team, but also future growth. Because if something is too niche and too difficult to recruit for, it might take 9 months to find a certain individual. Whereas if a more open source language is used, it might only take 3 months. I think you can onboard the person faster than if you had done like the 9-month individual. So these are just all very important factors to really keep in mind. So this is why I think I like to always view recruiting at any company. Once again, I could be biased since I'm in recruiting, but I always like to view recruiting as essentially like a strategic partnership, because too often at companies, recruiting is seen as like a reactive function. So if someone leaves the company, recruiting fills it. Whereas a more strategic partnership is like, how do we basically scale our hiring and how can we like increase our offer acceptance, reduce attrition? Because oftentimes recruiters are often speaking to like a lot of individuals. They have a little bit more subject matter expertise from a talent perspective. So that's why I always like it when like hiring teams involve recruiting, because they have like a certain level of expertise that can really be helpful in advising.
Got it. Now let's look on the other side of the tech stack, right? In terms of like you as a tech recruiter, right? What are the tools that you guys that you generally tend to use, and what are the tools that you can swear by? Or maybe you don't really have to name the tools that you use, but maybe at the broad categories, like what do you use on a regular basis for you to kind of get success in terms of tech recruiting? And again, how do you stay ahead of the game?
Yeah, of course. And this could also apply for like non-technical recruiting. Because once again, like the job description, what works for like tech and eng recruiting often works for like other types of recruiting. So step one, this goes sound like a very simplistic step, but it's something that has really allowed me to be a high performer in any of my roles. It's really understanding the current landscape of the tech scene. And how I do this is by making sure I'm up to date with just like certain like organizations. So for me, some of the resources I like to use is like Wall Street Journal, TechCrunch. Any of these resources is very important to understand the current landscape, like understanding like the org maps of such large companies, understanding basically any type of like shifts. And the reason why I think information is very important is in recruiting, information is currency. And so it's very valuable for a recruiter, tech or non-tech, to really be knowledgeable of the industry as a whole. So that's step one, is just like informational resources. Step two, that I think is like very important from like a recruitment perspective, it's really making sure you have like the right tools in place. So with myself, I use, of course, LinkedIn Recruiter, and I use like a few other programs, such as like Interstellar or Gem. This has really helped me personalize my outreach to candidates and really help to, at the end of the day, use data. So like these are various programs that allows you to email candidates. And these programs allows you to basically track open rate, reply rate. And this just gives recruiter a more data-driven solution. So for example, if you send an email to a candidate and you send 100 emails to 100 candidates and you have only like 10% open rate, then maybe your subject line has to be changed. Maybe the body of the email has to be changed. It just gives you more data to construct a better experience from both a recruiter experience, but also from the candidate experience. So those are like the two main tools I like to use, are like specialized tools that allows me to track how I'm doing as a recruiter in terms of like open rate, reply rate, and then of course, having informational resources.
Got it. And how about tools, maybe from a tech engagement perspective? I mean, I see a lot of times recruiters tend to ignore tools which are like to engage a specific, like a specific department, a specific section. Like for instance, I think the stuff that you need to kind of engage tech talent is probably different from the stuff that you really need to engage non-tech talent. So is there anything separate that you use or you would recommend in order to kind of engage tech talent better as well?
Yeah, one thing that I'm currently experimenting on, and I myself am getting better on this because I'm still a little bit newer in this particular field, is really utilizing Slack and its different communities to recruit talent. So this tends to be a little bit more popular on the product and engineering side compared to like non-technical recruiter. Non-technical recruiter, I feel from my experience, lives primarily on LinkedIn. But one interesting trend I've been noticing is the usage of open Slack communities to recruit from Slack. So that's something that's really interesting, and I myself am getting better, and I'm trying to get involved in more Slack communities. But that has been like a very interesting trend that I've noticed now compared to like 5 years ago, when I felt like 5 years ago was primarily dominated by LinkedIn with a small percentage on like GitHub as well as like Twitter. Nowadays, I feel like Slack communities are becoming more and more prevalent and more relevant.
Interesting. And that's a trend that we're seeing as well. Right? I mean, we've been part of a lot of Slack communities, and we tend to like source a lot of good candidates that way as well through those Slack communities, right? From the developer side of the equation, not just from the recruiter side of the equation too. All right, I think we can move on. Right. Okay. So I know this seems like a very straightforward HackerEarth-ish kind of a question, to be honest, but I think it's still a concern with respect to technical recruiting today. So just to give you a little bit of context rather, 10 years ago, when I first kind of ventured out into the technical assessment space, I used to talk to a lot of companies, and they used to tell me, hey, we assess coding talent really well. We give them a piece of paper and a pen to write code, and voila, you're done. But you can't really assess someone from code written on a piece of paper. But we've come a long way since then, right? We've come to a point where technical assessments have become pretty much an integral part of the entire process. Now, what's your opinion on the whole coding assessments thing? And the second part of that question as well is something that's been in the back of my mind for a while. We've gotten to a point where technical assessments are really strong, but obviously there's room for improvement, right? Obviously there's some sort of evolution that we can have with technical assessments. So what should it evolve to in order to kind of better test candidates as well?
Yeah, no, of course. And I feel like this is always like a very interesting question between like the take-home project or the coding assessments versus a live coding via Hangouts or in person. I feel like these are always like two ways of thoughts or two avenues of thoughts. I think, in my opinion, it all depends on like the particular company. Some has a culture of like coding assessments, others have a culture of more of like doing live coding hangouts. But I think we can always take like go one level deeper, where regardless if it's assessments or like live coding hangouts, I think what is very, very important and what is often overlooked, because I feel like a lot of times companies just try to think of like take home project versus live coding over VCs. But what is unfortunately being overlooked that I've seen a lot of times is the question given signal to the company? Because I feel like a lot of time, a lot of coding assessments and even a lot of live coding hangouts over video conference, they usually ask brain teasers or they ask questions that have like no relevance to the role itself. It's like reversing like linked lists or something that the individual might not ever use in their role themselves. So I think step one is always diving deeper and really asking the engineering team, does this assessment or does this interviewing coding question, is it relevant and does it represent what an individual does on this particular team? Because too many companies, whether it's like this small companies, big companies, they usually often, in my opinion, from my experience, they ask irrelevant questions. So step one in making a better assessment, and this influences my opinion on coding assessment, is you have to make it relevant to the role itself. Another important thing that once again I think gets overlooked a lot is tracking the progress of individuals who passes the coding assessments or the live coding question, tracking the success to a successful on-site to all. But the reason why this is very important is it's indicative and it gives you signal of whether the coding assessment or the live coding question predicts success on an on-site. Because a lot of times, so many companies like, did a candidate pass? Great, let's move them on. But if you have like 90% of candidates passing the assessment stage, but only 5% pass to the on-site stage, clearly it's something's going wrong, right? It's because it's not giving you enough signal. So tracking the progress, that's more on the recruiter or the talent partner, and on the engineering or product individual and teams, that's more really asking them, does the assessment or does the question give them enough signal to predict success? So that's what I usually like to think of, like my opinion, coding assessments. It sounds very simple, but very hard to implement. Is, does this test something that's very relevant to the role itself? And to answer the second part of the question, can assessments evolve to better test candidates? Absolutely. And I think for the second part of the question, it requires both the engineering or the technical team and the recruiting team. Technical team to ensure that it gives you signal, and the recruiter or talent team to track the data to say, hey, if a candidate passes this assessment, there's a 50, 60, 70% chance that they'll end up getting an offer. That's valuable. And at the same time, talent can use this as like a guardrail. With too many people are passing assessments and too little people get an offer, something has to be changed. But if a high number of people who passes the assessment gets an offer a higher percentage of time, then that gives good signal. So it's really using data to really guide the teams in general.
Got it. And what do you think is a better approach, right? For instance, a lot of these companies tend to have like easier coding assessments at level one, right? And then say, oh, you know what, we're gonna anyway analyze this candidate a little bit more in depth in the second round, and then maybe do a third interview. And then I know it stretches the process out a lot, but just so that more candidates enter into the funnel, I've seen companies kind of make it easy at step one. Do you prefer doing it that way, or do you like, hey, I have a company benchmark that I want to adhere to? Only certain folks who pass that benchmark would be in a position to make it to, right? So which way do you like to do it? Do you like to keep it easy at first, or do you like to go all in right from the start?
So once again, I feel like every company has their personal preference. So my preference would be actually to do the middle ground. So not choose something too easy, but not choose something too hard. I like to do it at the medium level just to give you like a baseline. And then from the medium level, then you could basically like prompt them a little bit more on like the more difficult questions for the on-site. But I think like good rule of thumb is I would say medium rank difficulty question. And the reason why I go with medium is sure, if you go with the easy question, but it kind of goes back to like, if you let too many people into the funnel, but not enough get offers, then you are basically a lot of engineering time, a lot of interviewing time is being utilized. So you want to be as strategic as possible because at the end of the day, you don't want to choose like the most difficult question you can think of because then too few get through. And you don't want to choose the easiest because too many get through. So I feel like the medium level questions give you like enough baseline. Because like once again, everyone has their strengths. So typically in my experience, when it comes to on-site interviewing, it's usually a combination of three parts, regardless of level. From what I've seen at companies I've been at, it's either behavioral interviews, system design interviews, and coding interviews. So this, by choosing the medium one, it gives you a chance to see the candidate answer like those three level of questions.
Got it. And do you also think it makes sense, and I don't know if a lot of companies do this today, but do you also think it makes sense to keep a track record of performance in these coding tests and interviews? Right? I mean, you've got your score. If it's a coding assessment, you've obviously got your score and how someone has performed in that test with respect to the difficulty and maybe the skill and the language involved. Right.
Yeah.
So, and oftentimes this actually stops after the interview or after the interview round, and then it's just put into an archive and not really accessed again. Do you recommend keeping track of those scores and saying, okay, over the course of maybe a year, there could be L&D programs involved? How did this person really fare against from where he or she started off and where they are right now? So do you think it makes sense to kind of get that on? Yeah.
Oh yeah, I think what I think is often overlooked, and you said like, unfortunately not a lot of companies do this, is oftentimes they sit on a lot of data, but they don't know how to utilize this data. So when it comes to interviewing data, I think it's absolutely important to really report and then just to really understand like the life cycle of interviews and even like the styles of questions. So like one common trend that I've noticed from my experience is typically like junior and mid-level candidates, they tend to do better on like live coding, weaker on system design, and then the reverse for senior staff engineers, but they tend to do better on system design for weak on live coding. And the only reason why I know that this like trend and insight is I always try to monitor not only whether a candidate passes an assessment or does not pass, but I always like to understand like what assessments are they passing? Is it live coded? Is it system design? Because that influences the way of thought. So I think it's very important to really gather as much data as possible and then always try to do like trend analyses, like let's say week over week, quarter over quarter, even probably team by team, just to really like take a step back. And then this is one thing that I've always loved doing in the past is even like interviewing calibration. So with an interviewer, if this interviewer is saying no to 95% of the candidates when the team is saying yes to 90%, it's like, okay, there's something here. So I like to use data in general, especially when it comes to interviewing data, as like guardrails. So it's not the end all be all, but it basically, once I see someone like going off the guardrails, it prompts me to like further investigate this.
Got it. Great. Thanks for that. I mean, obviously there's a lot to do to kind of make assessments a lot better. And maybe we can have a follow-up on that sometime. And it's good to chat on this topic. And I think we can move forward. Next question. Again, it's candid question that we ask every single recruiter, every single time. But an important one nonetheless, right? Like what are those key metrics? I mean, what are your key metrics, right? It makes like you evaluate well tech recruiting has gone so far, and how you evaluate yourself. What are those key metrics that matter to you?
Yeah, so when it comes to like recruiting, like tech recruiting, like functions, I always like to once again use metrics and use data to tell a story and to understand the narrative. Because far too often, a lot of organizations, they only look at one metric to judge hiring success, whether it's technical or non-technical. And oftentimes that's like the offer acceptance or like hires made, which is a great metric. I'm not saying otherwise. But there's so many other metrics that guides the journey of how a candidate goes from being a candidate to being an employee of a company. So I like to really take that step back and understand what metrics are important for me to tell the story of a candidate. And it starts with number one, understanding the open rates of emails. Because the way I see it, and the reason why I like open rates is you can't control or influence whether someone opens. I mean, that's if someone replies to your in-mail or your email, but you do have a high influence whether they would open the email itself, but not reply. So I like open rate to think of like top of funnel, because open rate, when you think about it, and some of my favorite subject lines, this is not giving away any secrets, but like I always like to kind of ask a question or basically have a very intriguing subject line. So for example, one subject line that I've been noticing that's been becoming more and more popular is just an emoji in the subject line, or you ask a question to a candidate. It's like, do you know this? Question mark. And no matter like how high the open rate gets, it's usually like 80 to 90% compared to engineering opportunity, like something like job related, because like you're not piquing the interest. So first of all, from a metric point of view, I like to do open rate from like the top of funnel. Now, when it comes to source to hire, that's another important metric to me. It's out of the individuals that I'm sourcing, how many actually does a take-home assessment, or how many gets to an on-site, and how many gets to an offer. Because when you think about it, is recruiter screen, on-site, and offer. These are three different stages. So it gives me an idea of how I'm doing, like what I call source to hire from that funnel right there. And then at the end of the funnel is offer acceptance rate. So I like those five metrics really. Open rate for top of funnel, understanding how I'm doing to attract talent from the people who I speak to, how many get to the assessment stage, how many gets to the on-site stage, and how many gets to the offer stage. Because once again, I like when it reaches to that stage, because once again, recruiters and companies, you can't control whether an individual accepts your offer. All you can really do, in my opinion, as a recruiter is really help guide them through the process and the journey of going from prospect all the way to employee. And at the end of it, what I like to do, whether an individual accepts or declines an offer of mine, I always like to get feedback for what we did, where did we do good, and where did we do not so good. Because I always like to think of the recruiting cycle as iterative. It could always be optimized. It could always be made better. And it really allows me to think about the candidate experience. And which kind of draws me to another part where if a candidate, and this has always been my personal philosophy, if a candidate has a great experience with you as a recruiter, they would be more likely to refer their individuals that they know to you. And this has happened many of times throughout my career. Because when you think about it, if you had like a really great experience, even if you end up declining the offer and you have someone in your network who might be looking, there's a higher chance that you might refer them to someone that you've had a pleasant experience. And one thing that I always like to joke about and I always like to say in recruiting is great people know other great people. Because when you think about it, if you have like a great finance person, chances are they might also know a great finance person. So I always like to operate from a recruiting perspective as a relationship manager. So that's the way I really approach like recruiting. But to answer and to recap the metrics that are important, open rate, individuals you source, how many get to like different various stages of interview, and then of those, how many essentially accepts your offer. And then one thing I like to do as well is taking it one step farther, is that's understanding the recruiting process where we did good and where we did not so good. So if you notice a trend going, you can make an action plan to reverse that. So for example, if a candidate was like, I like the process, however, I felt doing 6 interviews in a day was mentally exhausting, and you gather that data over 6 months, then you can make a recommendation to the leadership team saying like, hey, we've sampled over 6 months worth of interviewing data, and we noticed let's say like a 60% trend where a lot of candidates were like, it's tough doing 6 hours in one day. And then you come up with solutions where you say we either reduce the interview per day, or we split it up between 2 and 3 days. So that's a really great example of using data, but also using the data to tell a story and then making a strategy to address where we could be optimized.
Got it. And I'm curious to understand from the audience as well. Like, if you guys have metrics that you consider very near and dear, and it's something that you really keep an eye on, apart from what Cliff has already spoken about, feel free to add that into the chat box. We'll take a look at it and we can address that as well. Right. And Cliff, I really want to come back to the other end of the equation as well. So we spoke about the recruiter metrics that you really care about and the process that you really want to follow. Let's talk about the candidate, right? So oftentimes I get asked this question, right, from folks within my developer community. Yes, hey, I've got this great big interview. I've kind of passed a HackerEarth coding assessment. I'm going to talk to them for an interview. Do they really look at my soft skills? I can't really speak as well as as well as you do, as well as someone else does. Is that going to be a problem? Am I going to lose my dream job just because I can't really communicate that well? My code communicates better than I do, right? So I've got people coming to me with questions like that. So from a candidate's perspective, I know obviously you care about the technical skill, right? Is there anything else, right, that you would use to evaluate these candidates apart from core ability to code?
Yeah, of course. And I know the industry has a very high emphasis on like just purely hard skills. But in my opinion, the way I see it is no function, whether it's engineering, product, finance, legal, there's no function in any company that really operates by themselves, like as a solo individual. So if anything, I would say like soft skills, in my opinion, it might be more important than the traditional hard skills, to be quite honest. And the reason why I think soft skills are very, very important, it's really being able to work as a team collaboratively and really understanding just the nature of the team. Because at the end of the day, the way I see it is just like how people think about teams and sports. That's how teams are in like the business world, really. So oftentimes I feel like this is a stereotype where people are like, you just need to be really good on like a hacker rank and then you'll get the offer from everywhere. Is this true at some companies? Sure, of course. But from my perspective, I think soft skills are very, very important, if not more important than hard skills. And what I mean by soft skills is the ability to ask for help, the ability to collaborate, the ability to work with different types of individuals from different walks of life. All those, in my opinion, are more crucial than if you can just like completely get 100% on like a hacker rank.
So let's say I kind of like give you a scenario, right, wherein you get a candidate, let's say you had a coding assessment that was given out, right? And everybody maybe scored like maybe 50% marks. This person really aces it and goes and scores 100%, but way better than everybody else. And then you're like excited, like, whoa, it's really, really great. And then we move them into an interview phase, and then some of these soft skills that you're looking for, this person obviously doesn't possess that. Perhaps not a great team fit, perhaps communication, perhaps something else in terms of being able to kind of work within that team. How would you approach that? Would you go ahead and still say, hey, this person can code better than anybody else I've seen? I think he or she would be a fantastic addition to the team. I say, no, not a good team fit, so we probably need to move on.
Yeah, so usually in those situations, I always like to take a step back. So if I saw a candidate was in that situation, I'll probably advise two things. Is on the candidate end, I always like to like prep my candidates as best as possible and let them know what each interviewing process is like. So I would usually let them know what each module of the interview focuses on. So like the behavioral side will focus on your stakeholder management skills. So feel free to like read up and like study up on like how do you properly engage stakeholders. So like that's the candidate end. I believe it's the talent partner's job to really guide them in this journey. So really adequately prepping them, but not only in the hard skills section, but also like the softer skills section. And I usually actually like to recommend some frameworks. So one framework that I usually like to recommend a lot to a lot of my candidates, it's the STAR method: situation, task, action, response. So it basically just like forces you to think in the level of the framework to guide a proper answer. Because a lot of times when people tell a story, they're going to be all over the place. The STAR method, and then there's other methods as well. I like the STAR method just because it was the first method I learned and it's easy for me to remember, but there's many other methods. I like to just kind of like prompt them with that on not only the hard skills, but the soft skills. And then from the hiring team end, though, the way I like to see the talent partner is it's their role to coach the hiring manager. So just like we did like in the start of this conversation where really understanding the nice to haves and the must haves, it's really understanding and really asking and prompting the hiring manager. It's what is coachable and what is not coachable. So say, for example, if someone, and this happens to the best of us, this happens to all of us in some interviews, say if it was just like the individual's nervous, maybe they didn't interview for 5-6 years, really separating like if someone stumbled over their words or if they were not as articulate as possible, is that coachable? Is they learn in seminars? Is there webinars that we could use to kind of bridge that gap? Like how critical is that skill for them in the onboarding period? Because when you think about it, when you get onboarded to a team, it takes really at least like 3 to 6 months to be a productive member of the team. So can this individual bridge that gap in those 3 to 6 months? So understand what is coachable and what is not coachable. So say, for example, if someone was very demeaning or very condescending to a teammate, that is not as coachable because that is oftentimes like if you demean it to someone, from what I see, that's kind of like a personality trait. That's not as coachable to if someone is articulate as possible. So really understanding from the hiring team's perspective, what's coachable and what's not coachable.
Got it. So what's coachable are things obviously that you could probably let slide and then say, okay, this is something that we can fix later, but not coachable, mostly personality. I'm pretty sure that's very right. There's something like that.
Exactly. I always like to think of like the non-coachable. And, unfortunately, I've seen this in my like 10 plus years of recruiting, where sometimes you might be interviewing like, let's say like a director candidate. The director candidate is very nice and cordial to like the directors, to the VPs. But if they were interviewed by a mid-level engineers, I've had comments, unfortunately, in the past where they were like, oh, I just didn't understand when this like lower level person was interviewing me. And I'm like, that right there, that's like a red flag. So like coachable, I like to think of as like yellow flags. Non-coachable is like red flags where like this, it basically should not be allowed right there. And it's quite interesting where when I've heard this happen multiple times about like the whole, if someone was on the same level or higher, the person was really nice, really cordial. Once they were like junior or mid-level, they became a different person. That right there is really indicative of what that person could have been like as an individual. So those are like some non-coachable examples I would have.
Right. And these are consistent across experience spans, right? I mean, it doesn't matter whether you're like a fresher, like just fresh out of college to a senior architect, maybe with like 10 to 15 years of experience. It doesn't matter across the spectrum.
There's some nuances, but like once again, this is why it's very important to have an open dialogue with the hiring manager. So I'll give an example. If an individual is like a new grad, maybe there's like a different focus on their skill set compared to if someone is like a VP or SVP level candidate, then they have to have like a certain level of like people management skills or like certain level of communication. So like it all depends on the role, but like once again, I feel like this is why it's very important for the talent partner and the hiring manager to really flush this out in the beginning stages of recruiting for a role, so the recruiter can understand what's coachable, what's like non-coachable. So at the end of the day, it's making the effective usage of everyone's time.
Got it. So basically, one of the themes that I've been able to pick up from this particular conversation is the entire tech recruiter and hiring manager's synchronicity, right? I mean, it obviously appears like if you guys aren't on the same page, then we're headed for disaster. Is that right?
Yeah, no, like it's very important for the recruiter and the hiring manager to be on the same page. And it's also very important for them to understand the why, because far too often feels like transactional in nature, but I feel like with a good hiring manager and a good recruiting partnership, it's really helping to have that strategic partnership rather than just being a transaction. Because like when you think about partnering with someone, you're giving your feedback and you're taking feedback in as well. And you iterate it on the original rather than just taking it at face value. So like this is why I always think partnership is the best way to describe recruiting's function to the team that they're hiring.
Got it. Okay, I think we can go on. We've got one question left and we're coming up on time as well. Okay, last question. And again, a cliched question as well. This has been asked a lot, but I want to get your thoughts on this as well. Is personal branding really, really that important when it comes to like trying to build your brand?
I am 100% confident that it does have a very high effect and influence on attracting great talent And this has been, I know I touched on this briefly earlier, but I'll get more into detail now, where I always compare recruiters and real estate agents, because when you think about it, there's a lot of recruiters, there's a lot of real estate agents. However, if you find a phenomenal recruiter and if you find a phenomenal real estate agent, there's a higher chance that that individual will recommend them to their network of individuals. Because when you think about it, with a recruiter and a brand, it goes back to philosophy. So my philosophy is focus on the person rather than the company. And once again, having been in this industry for 10 plus years, I have like my own stories about this, but there's been times where a candidate might have declined my first offer only to have 6 months down the line saying like, hey, I like working with you. Is there a way we can work together at that same company that they rejected? And I've also had times where the candidate rejects me at one company and they later join me at another company. So like, once again, all this had to do is with like the personal branding of a recruiter. And I think what really helps with a good recruiting brand, once again, this goes down very, very simplistic. There's nothing really groundbreaking, but it has helped me more times than I can say. It's for a good recruiter brand. I like transparency, because at the end of the day, the way I see it is a good recruiter is the candidate's advocate. You are helping the advocate, basically, you're helping the candidate join the company. So the way I see a good recruiter brand is simple concepts like transparency and just timely communications, because it frustrates me a little bit to hear how a lot of recruiters are simply, recruiters and companies like just ghost candidates, where I never really understood that personally. So I think open lines of communications and just transparency has helped so much. Once again, these two concepts are nothing groundbreaking, but they will vastly improve a recruiter's personal brand. If this candidate is like, hey, I didn't get the job with this recruiter, but they were very timely responding back to me and they were transparent in like the feedback itself. So those two concepts, once again, very simple, I know, but they have helped my recruiter branding for like the past 10 years. And it has helped establish some very long-term relationships with candidates. We talk about candidates who I placed back in like 2013. I still keep in touch. So to answer this question very, very simply, it absolutely helps to have a great personal branding as a recruiter. And oftentimes, as that personal branding, if you're labeled a transparent and a fast replier, those two just makes you stand out more than like 98% of like other recruiters.
Got it. So obviously it makes a big impact, right? So that's great. Thanks. And I think that's all the time we have for like my set of questions. Now I'm going to be looking into the audience questions, and I think you've got a few that's come in. I'm going to try to answer as much as I possibly can. I know we're coming up on time. Without further ado, let me just jump into it. Someone's asked, do you include in your JD that you're looking for a diverse candidate? Very quick question. What I like to say is I always like to indicate in the job description that we're open to all types of candidates, whether it's like backgrounds, educations, or different variables, just to, once again, kind of going back to the inclusive and neutral language. I like to really emphasize that throughout the job description itself. All right. So again, someone else has asked, what are the must-haves in your recruiter tech stack? Can you repeat the tools that you use on a daily basis?
Yep. So from a tooling side, it's one, informational resources. So information resources, some of the more popular one could be TechCrunch, New York Times, Wall Street Journal. From a tooling or product perspective, I like to use LinkedIn Recruiter just as like an aggregator of profiles. But one trend that I'm doing myself is Slack communities. And at the moment, I myself am trying to find like the best Slack communities where I'll just go to Google and type in like a particular role, Slack communities, and then I'll just kind of go into these open channels and start investigating it this way. And it's great because not everyone has a LinkedIn profile. So I like to use LinkedIn, but LinkedIn is not the end all be all. So I like to use like LinkedIn paired with Slack, paired with like meetups potentially. So just really understanding like the whole ecosystem. And I don't think of it as like a zero-sum game where you have to use LinkedIn and then that's it. I like to experiment with like Slack, maybe a little bit of Twitter, GitHub. So that's for like what I consider like sourcing candidates. And then in communication with candidates, I like to use some type of like email software. So there's various programs for this, like Intello, Gem, Interstellar. All these programs at the core is the ability to email candidates and to basically track open rate, reply rate. So this just makes your recruiting approach a little bit more data driven.
Got it. And so maybe we can list some of those out in a follow-up email so that the entire audience kind of like catch it all the time. But I think it's pretty important, especially your information sources as well, because I did get a question on like the kind of information sources that you really use, and then like how do you go about using them. So maybe we can, for the benefit of the audience, you'll definitely be able to hear that in detail from Cliff in a follow-up email.
Sure.
So another question that we've got is, what do you use to keep track of candidates and resumes that you've reviewed?
Yep. So with us, I use the applicant tracking system Greenhouse. There are other applicant tracking systems like Level. I'm more of a fan of Greenhouse just because it's very customizable and it's easier to like extract data. So at the high level, I'll recommend some type of applicant tracking system. My personal preference for applicant tracking system to really just track the candidate journey and life cycle and resumes and all the nuances and details associated with the candidate. I like Greenhouse.
Got it. Okay. Just a couple more questions, then we'll quickly wrap it up. So someone's asked if you use different emojis on your email subject lines and if they end up going to spam as well.
Oh, no. So actually, I have not encountered this just yet. I could be wrong with this. With Gmail, I think it classifies spam if you have like a certain Gmail score. Once again, Google doesn't release what classifies as spam and not spam, but essentially, if too many of your emails are being marked as spam, so for example, if I message 100 candidates and 70% of them marks my email as spam, done for the other 30%, it'll go directly into spam. Theoretically, it's affects your Gmail score, but yeah, as long as a lot of people don't mark your email as spam, it will not go into spam in the future.
Got it. Okay. Cool. And I think we've got just one last question, and I think we've already addressed it. Is it important for developers to have good soft skills? Well, yeah, we've already mentioned that it is. Yeah.
And I think if anything, having softer skills, I've seen this before in the past where individuals who might not have like the perfect performance on the technical portions, just because they had like really great soft skills, I've seen them get offers in the past as well. Because at the end of the day, soft skills really test, can this individual basically ask for help? Are they self-aware? And like oftentimes softer skills give you more leeway in general. So I think it's absolutely imperative. And then this goes for not only like developers, but like for any individual, softer skills, I feel might be slightly more important, because I always use this term culture add, because when people say culture fit, it implies people fit into a box. I like culture add. It's like if someone has really good soft skills, they could be a great culture add to the organization, to the team. So that's why I've always been a really great fan of an individual with great soft skills.
Got it. Okay. Cool. So I don't think I have any more questions, and I think that's all we have time for today as well. So Cliff, once again, thank you very much for taking the time out to be part of this webinar. It was a very informative session, and I'm sure the audience will agree as well. So thank you, Cliff.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me, and have a great day, everyone.
Yeah, and for the audience, for the next episode of TIR, This is Recruiting, we've got a really interesting conversation lined up at the end of August. It's on recruiting in the metaverse, and I would recommend everyone to please sign up for that and then have a listen, because this is definitely something that I can guarantee will be a game changer to recruiting when it comes to recruiting in the metaverse. So thank you everyone for attending, and have a great rest of the week.